unless we were there in Liverpool and Hamburg, as John said, no, if you didn't see the Beatles at those times, playing live, playing straight rock, you never saw the real Beatles.
Funny how we all have opinions about Pete and Ringo, and like we don't know these guys, and what do I really know? And when you put it all these different ways, I'm thinking like, why do I feel so sure about my answers on the question? Like, why do I feel so sure that Ringo was just perfect? You know,
because we've got hindsight.
Yeah.
As I say in the Finding the Fourth Beatle, when Pete leaves, that is the end of the Beatles. And a brand new pop group called the Fab Four are born. The covers rock and roll band who have been tearing up Liverpool and Hamburg, unlike anything anybody had ever seen before, have now got to dress up nicely in their suits and play pop music.
right?
And original songs in a recording studio. That's completely different to playing live.
We got this great quote from your book, actually, from Finding the Fourth Beatle.
Yeah.
And the great quote was from George Martin saying, yeah, sometimes the timing varies with Ringo, but he's always doing it just right. Just right for the song.
Exactly. Now, Ringo, because of his background, playing with Rory Storm, the Hurricanes, playing at the holiday camps, where you'd have to play a great variety of musical styles to entertain, he had all these different musical rhythms that he could pick out of his head and say, oh, I'll do the variation on this one this time. And he'd always find the right rhythm at the right time for the right song. And that's a skill you cannot teach. That's a natural ability that he has.
Right. So Ringo is adapted for the next stage.
Correct. Yeah, he's perfect for it.
I've heard that I've done it myself. I think that was the thing, was that exactly that Pete was not necessarily at that moment prepared to make that transition, and Ringo was already there.
Beatles 60, we're jumping around.
Our guest today will be no stranger to most Beatles 60 listeners. David Bedford's a prolific author who's published books on the Beatles in Liverpool, the latest one covering also 3 other Beatles cities. Another book on their story told through 23 drummers, which we've quoted in our past podcast episodes. A 2014 book on the group's musical influences, I Want to Get That, and also a book on country music in the Nashville of the North. Let's see, Dave's co-writer of other books, as well as associate producer and historian for the documentary film Looking for Lennon. He's also a prolific YouTube vlogger, and he takes us on virtual tours on YouTube around Liverpool. So without further ado, welcome to Beatles Live, Dave. I'm going to shut up and let you two take over.
That was great, mate. Thank you so much.
62 was a huge year for actually getting on a label, changing the drummer, getting an image going on. Were they confident already?
Well, I think the end of 61, just before Brian comes on the scene, they'd established themselves as the top group in Liverpool, top group in Hamburg. But they were sort of thinking, well, where do we go now? The only way they could have gone, which was really down to London to get a record deal.
Yeah.
They'd done some of everything else. If that wasn't possible, if they hadn't got the record contract, that would have been it. They'd have packed in. So what Brian does, Brian gives them hope, and he says, I'll get you a record contract. And like you were saying before about their attitude, their mindset, everything is on. We have got to do whatever it takes to get this record contract. So Brian gets them the Decca audition. So they failed that, and they were so deflated. People criticised them for Decca. Some people tried to say that's the reason they got rid of Pete, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
Paul doesn't come over very well at all at Deco. George is a little bit iffy. John was sort of okay-ish. I think George was the best singer. When you listen to Deco audition, George is the best vocal performance. And Brian, of course, through his contacts, gets them in front of George Martin. They're nervous as hell, like they were for Decca. So, they were nervous. And obviously, they're going back. They get their audition. They do the audition, and it isn't great. Musically, it's not perfect. But what wins George Martin over is once they start joking with him, and George warms to their personalities. And he said he could see there was something in them.
Yeah.
But musically, they needed a lot of work. Now, this is where all the Pete Best stuff unravels.
Yeah.
I have these discussions so many times of people trying to rewrite history or say, oh, well, John said in 1971, Pete was a lousy drummer, we were always going to get rid of him. Yeah, John said a lot of things.
Yes.
Depends which day of the week. Yeah. He changed his mind more often than he changed his socks. So you can't just go on one thing. The only evidence there is that when George Martin says to Brian Epstein, don't mind what you do with them as a group. He said, but if we make a record, this was the big thing. They were not under contract. This was their very last chance. If I give you a contract, I'm going to use a session drummer. Now, Brian doesn't understand studio protocols. That was a common way of doing things back then.
Completely commonplace, yeah.
So, as Paul has said, Pete was a great drummer playing live. But if the record producer is saying, if we get a contract, he's not good enough for the record, then we've got to change him. And you can't blame them. For these three lads, this was their very last chance. If they don't get the contract, that's the end of the Beatles. So, if it means they have to ditch their drummer because the producer has said he's not good enough for playing on the record, then they do that. And, Paul has said it, as John has said, we were cowardly the way we did it.
Yeah.
But you had to be ruthless. The young men, this is what they've been working on for years and years. This was their final chance. And they did nothing until George Martin says, okay, you've got your contract. Then they decided to replace him. So they thought about it, but they weren't going to do anything till they got the contract through. Once they got the contract, that's when they start approaching other drummers. So it is cruel on Pete. And so many people have been so unfair. Oh, he's a lousy drummer. He was incompetent. He couldn't keep time. He couldn't play drums. I mean, it's complete nonsense. I don't know if you guys are musicians, but I started playing guitar when I was like 14.
Yeah.
And I played with lots of different drummers. And very, very quickly whether somebody can play drums or they can't. If they can keep time or they can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't take you 2 years and thousands of hours. Then you go, oh, hang on a sec. For the last 2 years, he's not been keeping time. I mean, that to me is actually questioning the qualities of John, Paul and George as musicians, saying, you tell me they couldn't spot a bad drummer. If they were going to replace him and they were ruthless, if he wasn't good enough, they'd have done it. Plenty of opportunities to do it and didn't. But they felt they had no option. So they looked for another drummer. And they asked, the three other guys. Ringo was the one of the four they asked, who says yes. But, and as you know, I make this point in finding the fourth Beatle.
Yeah.
Because the story, in a way, is how they get to Ringo. It would not have worked in the same way with any other drummer other than Ringo. He brought so many unique qualities, and he was that last little bit of the jigsaw.
Yeah.
That slotted in. Now, the amount of people I've spoken to, particularly drummers who were in Merseybeat groups, who couldn't understand why they replaced Pete with Ringo. Because none of us, unless we were there in Liverpool and Hamburg, as John said, if you didn't see the Beatles at those times, playing live, playing straight rock, you never saw the real Beatles. If you didn't see them at that point, their sound was largely based on Pete's drumming. one of those things that, as I say in the Finding the Fourth Beatle, when Pete leaves, that is the end of the Beatles, and a brand new pop group called the Fab Four are born. The covers rock and roll band who have been tearing up Liverpool and Hamburg, unlike anything anybody had ever seen before, have now got to dress up nicely in their suits and play pop music.
Right.
And original songs in a recording studio. That's completely different to playing live.
That's an interesting take, yeah.
And that's why, with these comparisons of Pete and Ringo, I have to say to people, you can't compare one thing with the other. Say, oh, Pete wouldn't keep time. Listen to My Bonnie. Listen to Pete's drumming on My Bonnie. The speed and the accuracy of playing the drum roll on that, it's phenomenal.
He does snare rolls and he comes back on one very well. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and not many drummers could do that.
What would have been cool is if Lennon in the 70s, when he did the rock and roll album, he could have had Pete as drummer instead of, was it Alan White or Andy White?
It wasn't Andy White.
Alan White.
No. Andy White did his one thing in 62, that was it.
Yeah.
Probably Jim Keltner. Yes, but could have had Pete. It would have been great.
But again, you see, people sort of brush over the fact that, Pete wasn't good enough for George Martin in June, but Ringo wasn't good enough for George Martin in September.
That's right, yeah.
And as Paul McCartney said, and it's one of those quotes that people don't often like to be reminded of, at that point, Ringo wasn't that steady on time, but he's rock solid now. And that's because when you play live, your tempo varies. The speed you do a song at depends on who does the counting. And you speed up and slow down at different parts during a song, because that's what you do when you're playing live. It's a totally different matter when you're playing in a studio.
Right.
But that's when you're expected to be spot on.
Right.
And that's why session drummers in particular were so vital, because they could come in, hear a song, think, right, you need this rhythm. They know the studio, they know the recording engineers, and they would say, right, that's it, and they would play it perfectly.
We got this great quote from your book, actually, from the 23 Drummers book, whatever it was. The title, 23 Drummers?
Finding the Fourth Beatle.
Finding the Fourth Beatle.
Yeah.
And the great quote was from George Martin saying, sometimes the timing varies with Ringo, but he's always doing it just right. Just right for the song.
Exactly. Now, so it's okay if Ringo doesn't keep time, but it's not okay if Pete doesn't keep time.
Yeah.
Is that what we're saying? And what we're saying is,
Right.
you've got to allow both. And my argument is always appreciate and thank Pete for what he did in those 2 years, because without him, they would not have got to the stage of getting Brian Epstein and getting a record contract.
Without him, without Mona, without the Casbah.
Absolutely right. And that's my job has always been, is telling those stories of the people who get us to 1962. As I found in my second book, The Fab 104. 104 people who play a part in the story all deserve their credit.
Yeah.
But Pete deserves huge credit.
Yes.
For being with the Beatles. And, John says that was when they were at their best, playing the straight rock. That was with Pete. That's when they were a fantastic rock and roll band, but they became this different group. A pop group, playing original music. And Ringo, because of his background, playing with Rory Storm, the Hurricanes, playing at the holiday camps, where you'd have to play a great variety of musical styles to entertain. He had all these different musical rhythms that he could pick out of his head. And say, oh, I'll do the variation on this one this time. And he'd always find the right rhythm at the right time for the right song. And that's a skill you cannot teach. That's a natural ability that he has.
Right. So Ringo is adapted for the next stage.
Correct. Yeah, he's perfect for it.
I've heard that said. I've done it myself. I think that was the thing, was that exactly that Pete was not necessarily at that moment prepared to make that transition, and Ringo was already there. So,
almost. It's not that Pete wasn't prepared to. He was never given the opportunity.
That right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when Ringo failed at the first time with Love Me Do, they didn't get rid of him. He was given another opportunity. And he proved his adaptability to do what was being asked of him.
But yeah, we all have opinions about Pete and Ringo, and like we don't know these guys, and what do I really know? And when you put it all these different ways, I'm thinking like, why do I feel so sure about my answers on the question? Like, why do I feel so sure that Ringo was just perfect?
Because we've got hindsight.
Yeah.
And what I always say to everybody is, don't tell me Ringo was perfect because you listened to Rain. Because that was not the decision they were making in August 1962.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Forget everything else. What information was available to them in 1962? And you knew Ringo was playing Rory Storm the Hurricanes. They got to know him in Hamburg. He'd sat in 2 or 3 times with them. They knew what they were getting, but none of them had any idea what was going to follow. Ringo didn't know their original songs, which is why they weren't surprised, but Ringo was, when they walk in on the 11th of September and Andy White's setting up. John, Paul and George hadn't thought to mention to Ringo that he wasn't going to be playing.
Yeah.
But George Martin never had any intention, really, of Ringo playing on that first single.
Mm-hmm.
And then by accident, the wrong version's released.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh,
Right. As the single, right?
Yeah.
As the single, yeah. And so Ringo, said for years and years, I didn't play on the first single.
Andy and Larry appreciate those who listen all through the regular podcast episodes. So we have a new, very cool bonus for you, an exclusive monthly event called Beatles 60 Live. The live show is audio, not video. First weekend of every month, membership is free and audio access is free. It's all free and easy. This audio doesn't appear in the normal podcast feed, but you can access it from anywhere in the world by signing up for Beatles 60 Live. Once you sign up, you'll see how easy access is. Okay, here's how you find the members page. There's just one simple little trick. See this episode notes. Find the Beatles 60.group link. Open that in any browser. To get to the secret live page for members, just add live at the end. So it's Beatles60.group/live. Again, Beatles60.group/live. The first time you get there, you'll have to sign up. It takes just a couple of seconds. Just enter any name and valid email, and you're there. Bob's your uncle. It's that straightforward. Got it? That's Beatles60.group/live. We'll email you in advance of each live so you'll know the exact time to listen, specified in most world time zones. And you'll have a convenient invitation link sent to you privately. You'll find stuff easily using the members-only navigation. Dead simple once you're in. Full live event information is all there. If you have any trouble, just contact Andy. He can give you the link privately or resend the confirmation email or whatever. Members who miss the live event can listen later. We'll archive each one on the Beatles 60 Live page. You can just choose a past date, hit the play button, and listen anytime. Hope you can join.
I just want to add that your email address is safe with me. I'm the only one who will email you no more than once a month to announce each event, and it's easy to unsubscribe. You have my word.
Andy is trustworthy. Come and join our little insider community, guys.
So in terms of like alternative history, we could imagine that it could have happened that they pushed to have Pete allowed to record with them, and could have been different. Maybe.
Well, yeah, because the 4th of September, when you go back down there, George Martin says, hang on, who's this guy?
Yeah.
And so, well, this is Ringo who's replaced Pete. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Nobody told me you changed the drummer.
Right.
Andy, you want to take us out?
I don't know. How am I taking us out? You already said. Yeah, seriously, thank you so much for coming on. I think this is one of the most amazing things about starting this kind of podcast project. Has been like, I'm not talking to some of the people whose books I use as references, you know. So it's really nice. Thank you so much for being.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It really has.
This is Beatles 60.
This was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find one or two other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient, but our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles 60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles 60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who have been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological historiographic study.
Larry.
Eh?
What's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years, as nothing could make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle. Chronicle.
Beatles 60. We ain't jumping around.